Roddy, looming minefield as far as people, immigrants coming over to work here, and if something serious happens?
Yes, I wouldn't like to think of immigrants as, shall we say, a minefield, given that my wife is one. But,
but you know, I mean, the pros and cons if something happens,
yes.
there is.
Yeah, jokes aside, there is pros and cons, and I think my wife's a really good example, actually. She's Canadian, and all her family and their entirety are in the middle of nowhere. I think they call it Alberta.
You're in trouble when you get home.
Exactly. No, she's from a farming family in Alberta,
yep.
And they have a local cemetery a couple of kilometres down the road where you can see every generation that's ever farmed there, you know, going back four to five generations. And so for her, she'll be the first time that one of her family members is likely to die overseas, you know, all other things being equal, and that is going to raise a couple of challenges probably for our children, hopefully not for me, because I'm preferred I'd go first. Let her worry about it. But there's all sorts of issues regarding does the body be repatriated? Do you have a funeral here in this country and then another one in the country of birth? Is there a celebration here and then a memorial service over there? All of these things have legal and financial implications. And so bring it more relevant to perhaps the audience who are not in my situation but are hiring folks from overseas, whether they be migrant workers under the government schemes, whether they be people from Pacific Islands, where they come from the Philippines, working in the dairy industry. They have got some serious concerns because often folks overseas have very specific funeral rites that need to be dealt with. And I've recently, in the last sort of 2 weeks, we've had 3 what I would consider outside ethnic funerals, as in they were funerals that had huge influence from the folks overseas, and they were very, very expensive. There was a lot of hoops to jump through, and in one particular case we had some serious hoops regarding documentation that the home country required, proof that our documents were real, proof that the person had died, all these sorts of implications.
It's not just a doctor's certificate like we have for locals.
No, I fell into the unusual situation where we had a death certificate produced by Burst Deaths and Marriages out of Wellington, and the embassy turned around and said, prove that it's real. And I was like, oh, okay.
It's got the official stamp on it.
Exactly. But supposedly there is a department of authentication that didn't know about this, and you can pay a sum of money to get special seals and stamps put on it. But that was part of the process that needed to be dealt with, and once we're aware of it, it's fairly smooth. But at the same time, being aware of these things, and particularly if you're the only person in contact, for example, if you have a dairy worker that's come from, say, I don't know, Sri Lanka, and you are expected to do all of the paperwork on their behalf. They have no family here. You're the liaison. The family in Sri Lanka is expecting to see either the deceased person come home or their ashes come home, and they don't have the financial capability to do it themselves. Where the responsibility legally starts and ends is an interesting question, and also the moral responsibility that you've taken this person into your care, and once they've passed away, that care doesn't end. And so there are those things that need to be dealt with quite carefully. And we talked a few months ago about this and how that it would behoove a lot of employers to invest in a small life insurance policy with at least the amount that would cover these sorts of things. And so we encourage people to come in and talk to us, and we can give them the sort of the worst case scenarios and say, well, if you have to do this based on where that person's from, this is what it's going to cost. Here are the legal hoops that you'll need to jump through. Here's what we can do to help. Here's what you'll need to do on your own. And here's what the bill will be from all ends of it. And that can be quite useful because it might not be a big sum. You know, it might be somewhere around the $15,000 to $20,000 will get the job done.
Yeah, but $15,000 to $20,000 you haven't budgeted for, Roddy.
That's true if you've got to pay it in cash, but if you've got a policy that might only be a few dollars a month, you know, it might be $20 or $30 a month for a life insurance policy to cover that. So it becomes a question of doing simple math. It might be more than that. You know, you might have a person who's at risk and all those sorts of things. So have you got medical records? Are you going to be on the hook if someone gets seriously ill? They don't die, but they've still got to go home to their home country and they have no money to do it.
Burst appendicitis, or God knows what could happen, isn't it?
Exactly. So I think there's a lot of what-if scenarios out there that are going to happen more and more often because we have got a growing immigrant population. They come from all over the world. English is often not their first language, and particularly the people who are back home don't have English. They don't have any understanding of our culture, of our rules. They don't understand why they can't do this, that, and the next thing. And we have no ability to talk to them to explain it. And to be honest, embassies can be as useless. Well, exactly.
I was just going to say the other problem is that there's probably rules whether that person can be cremated or left as in a tin line coffin?
Well, I'll give you an example. I had a family, this is very recently, a family, they decided to leave the person here in Christchurch, bury them in Christchurch Cemetery. Mother was agreed, however, family members back in Asia want the body back there. It's all to do with the a family shrine, I guess, that they need to be interred in. And the funeral account was paid, and then 2 days later I got a call from the person that just done a full funeral for a full burial saying how much to dig the person back up and shift them to China. The question that they hadn't realised is that all of a sudden we're not dealing with a clean scenario anymore. The person has been interred in New Zealand soil, so you've got biosecurity for China, you've got biosecurity for New Zealand. It just, the can of worms just got really, really large. It was a garbage can of worms. And it was something that we had to work through. At this stage we've convinced them, and the cost would have been nearly double of what the original funeral cost. And so this was on top of it. And these are the situations, and particularly with China, you've often got one child who, because of the one child rule, you've got two parents, so you've got one child who's got to fund all of this. It's not like there's a family to have a whip around, but you've got uncles and aunties who play a very heavy cultural card, respecting your elders, etc., putting massive pressure on this person who is dealing with a death in a foreign country of a parent who's been out here, and they're grieving, and they've got all these things thrown at them. So,
and the language barriers.
And the language barriers. Yeah, that was challenging in of itself. How do you explain the concept of a grave to somebody who doesn't understand the word grave or cemetery or burial or any of the words we use to elucidate what the problem would be? So the issue for us was, what do they actually need? What is the law? And what's the best we can do for them so that they're not going to have problems either financially, legally, or shall we say morally / religious issues back home. And so these are the things that we sort of bring together and try and give people advice in advance. And it sounds a little morbid, but at the end of the day, this is going to happen to everybody. All right. So it should be a conversation we have. It should be a conversation that New Zealanders have with themselves. Okay, you've got a son and a daughter. Like, I've got three sisters. All of them are working in Australia. One in Perth, one in Townsville, one in Alice Springs. They've picked, the most remote spots they can get to.
Who are they getting away from, Roddy?
It's an exceedingly a good question. Don't think it's me. I hope it's not me. But the point I'm making is that they alone have all indicated they want to come back to New Zealand. Well, there's a cost associated with that. Throw into the fact that Australia only embalms 30% of the time.
And that heat?
And believe it or not, they have what they call a Kelvinator method. Essentially, they refrigerate. So there's also, and that's just between two countries who are almost identical in terms of culture in many respects, and yet in their funerary practices, they're distinctly different from us. And so you've got all of these things, because it's just a lack of skill set. You could be in the middle of a town, Alice Springs, and the funeral director there has never done a repatriation embalm in his life. Ooh. What do you do? So these are the conversations that need to be had.